Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence, and if there is any praise, dwell on these things. Do what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a new Sunday of a new year, and I thought we would take this time to go over our goals and our themes that we'll be dealing with in the coming year. I know biblical goals and themes, goals and themes are not exactly biblical examples. You won't open up 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians and find the yearly theme of the church in Corinth. But however, taking time to meditate upon one thing is a biblical example. And I asked Matthew to read that passage because there are certain things we think about, we dwell upon, that are good things. And the more we think about them and the more we dwell upon them, the richer they become. And so there are a few things that we'll be dealing with throughout this year, that we'll be thinking about, that we'll be dwelling upon. And those I'm going to present for you this morning. These were chosen, not just by me. These were discussed by the men in our men's meeting, and it was brought forward by some other people in the church, things that they thought this church should focus upon for this coming year. And so this is really a group mindset, a group effort, that we all think that there are certain things that are good for us to grow in, and we can see a need for us to grow in some of these things. So that's what we'll be looking at this morning. It's not going to be a typical lesson, but it'll just be preparing us really for what's to come in the following year. The first theme is the stronger presence in our community. This has been a theme or a goal of the Wallingford Church since I've been here, and I'm sure for longer than that. This is, as far as I know, at least the third year in a row that this has been a goal for this church. And I think it's a good goal to have. I don't mean to say that we've been doing this for too long. It's a very good goal to have. In fact, there are scriptural concepts that really suggest this is a part of the work of the church, that we need to be a presence in the community. We need to be reaching out to people, whether they respond or not. And so I have some passages here for you to consider, and throughout this lesson, I'm going to have all these passages that we'll look at up on the screen, the ones we have time for. So one is going to be, of course, in Acts 4:12, where Peter says that there's really salvation in no one else. Peter says that there's salvation in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. We have a presence in our community because if we're not going to teach people about Jesus, who is? So we need, this is a very scriptural concept, reaching out to the lost, showing mercy really on those who doubt, as Jude writes. So we reach out and have a presence in the community because there's really salvation in no one else, and we want people to be saved. And if we don't want people to be saved, we really need to reevaluate our own mindset and our own attitude. So there's salvation in no one else. And of course, Jesus himself taught us that we are lights in the world. So in Matthew 5:14 and 16, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So clearly, Jesus instructs disciples to be a presence. to be a light to the world. This doesn't even say that it's so that they will become Christians. It's actually so that they will glorify your Father who is in heaven, whether it's now or whether it's when Jesus returns. Our goal is to get people to glorify God, not to just kind of build up and increase our numbers. And of course, Paul teaches something very similar in Philippians 2:14 and 15. He says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world." So having a presence in our community is very biblical. This is not just a goal of the Wallingford Church that comes out of nowhere. This is a very biblical concept. And so there are some ways we discussed doing this. One is going to be passing out flyers to local businesses. We've done this a number of times. And if you've never done it or have not done it in a while, I would encourage you to be determined to maybe just do it one time this year. Just one time. And if you need flyers, I know you can talk to Michael. Michael has these flyers. He's been printing them out. So if you need those, please talk to him. So that's just one way we've been doing this. And there are places we've been hitting regularly that have actually had some traffic. And because I know Michael and I have put up flyers that have pull tabs on them. And we can kind of keep track of where people are taking them or not. I know Stop and Shop has a bulletin board. You don't have to talk to anyone. You just go up there and put it up. The Ion Bank, Panera Bread, and many different laundromats. All of them have been receiving foot traffic, and we can keep track of it because we can see the pull tabs are missing. They're very easy. You don't have to talk to anyone. You don't have to ask permission usually. You just go right in, you put it up, you walk out, and hey presto, it's done. So passing out flyers is one way. We'd like to continue doing this. Another is to continue participating and celebrate Wallingford. This last summer was my first time actually participating because the summer before we just handed out flyers during it. But it was very good, very profitable. A lot of great discussions that came from it, and I know a number of you came out and participated in that, so we'd like to continue doing that. We'd like to also continue organizing meetup studies. This has been very good. In fact, we just had a new visitor to our Thursday night study. And so we see this as a good thing, a profitable thing, a fruitful thing that we'd like to keep doing. And another way we discussed was having a class on evangelism at the building. This would be a class that I put together. I'll probably update as well. And it's a good class because it reminds us that evangelism is not as scary as we often make it out in our minds. Oftentimes, it seems like this impossible barrier to overcome. But through this class, I like to point out that not only is it easier than you probably think and possible, but there are many ways you probably already do it. You don't have to be standing on a street corner with a megaphone shouting at people. It often just comes up in regular conversations, in discussing with people your knowledge of God, why you're a Christian, that kind of a thing. So one of the points of this class is to equip people to do it and also to see that it's not as scary as we often make it out to be. So having a stronger presence in the community, of course, really means things like evangelizing. That's what that entails, to have a strong presence in the community. So there are some things I want us to keep in mind about evangelism in and of itself as we go throughout this year. That first of all, there's a balance. And what I mean by this is the focus of the church is not to be only on evangelizing, but the church should not neglect it either. So consider Acts. You read through Acts and you see an evangelistic effort, this outreach to save Jews and Gentiles. But then when you read through the epistles, there is no talk of instructing the church on how to reach the lost. In fact, the discussion is about how do you function as a church? How do you take care of your families? Who are you as a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, a mother, a brother, sister, all that kind of thing. So when we think about evangelism, I don't want us to get carried away in thinking that that is the most important part of the church. It's really not. It's one work the church does among many. So I want us to have a balanced understanding of evangelism. I want us to understand also that the goal in evangelizing is not to grow the numbers of the local church. It's really to teach people about God, whether they're going to listen or not. In fact, Jesus tried to teach people about God many times, and many people did not listen to him. There were entire towns that didn't listen to him. So the goal isn't to grow the local numbers of the church, to grow the church membership in terms of numbers. We can't think of it in that way and think of success and failure in that way, because that's not what we see in the New Testament. The goal is to teach people about God. And if they don't listen, that's between them and God. The last thing I'd like to say is that it's not the job of the evangelist to evangelize for the church. Now, I evangelize and I organize these meetup studies, one, because I have the time, and also because I'm a Christian, and because I can teach these things to people. But if you don't believe me, I would encourage you to look through 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, look at the role of an evangelist, and show me where Paul instructs Timothy and Titus to reach out to the lost. That's really not the role of the evangelist. The evangelist instructs and teaches the local church. However, I do go out and I do organize these things because, one, I can do it, like I said, but also I know before I came here that this was a major focus of this church. And so I want to continue respecting that. But it is not the job of the evangelist to evangelize for the church. This is a work that we all do together. So that's our first goal or theme, is to have a stronger presence in the community. And those are some ways we plan on going about it throughout this year. Another goal is a very simple one, is to have a better follow-up with visitors. There was a need seen for this, that we should be more consistent in how we follow up with people. So far, we've kind of had a sporadic following up with those who have visited. I know I've written cards to some people who have come and visited here in the past, and I know some of you have as well. But what we'd like to do is to get a couple people, volunteers, men and women, who will be a part of kind of a small rotating group, who will reach out to visitors, sending them cards or emails on a weekly or maybe a monthly basis. And we need just a couple people to volunteer. In 1 week or 1 month, it'll be one person's turn, and we'll rotate around. So if this is something that you can participate in, you have the time for, and you'd like to be a part of, this is something that the church would like to do. So please talk to me or talk to one of the other men so that we can get the ball rolling on this, to start following up more consistently with our visitors. So those are the first two goals: to have a stronger presence in our community and to have a better follow-up with visitors. The third goal, and this is going to be a major theme that is going to play out in my lessons throughout this year, is going to be personal development. And I have a couple examples of this, but I want us to focus on personal development in terms of not just group development, because I think reaching out in the community, better follow up with visitors, are many forms of group development. But I want us to understand personal development, because no one can stand before God for you on the day of judgment. It is only going to be you and God. And so we need to, on a very personal basis, not rely necessarily on other people in order to be our salvation for us. we need to grow and to develop a love for God, a love for the church, a spiritual mindset in our own walks, in our own lives. And that's what I'd like to focus on. And one way we're going to do this is going to be understanding and living out our roles within the church and our families. There's a lot of time spent in the epistles on this, on what it is to live out our roles and our responsibilities. And I'm not going to look at all these passages, but some examples of this are going to be that there are roles that men play, and then there are roles that women play. Then there are roles that older men and older women contribute to the church, but then there are roles that younger men and younger women contribute to the church. There are roles that husbands participate in toward their wives and vice versa. And there are roles that children play, really participate in with their parents and vice versa. And so I want us to focus on who we are based on age, based on gender, based on marital status, based on whether or not we have children, and how we can live out and grow into those roles. What God expects of us, because there are expectations. You notice that every one of these has passages backing them up. There are expectations that Paul instructed to Timothy, for example, and to Titus, that the older men are to behave in such a way. Older women are to behave in such a way. And the younger men are to focus and grow in certain areas as well as the younger women. So that's one way I want us to focus on personal development, is by identifying our role within the church and how we can grow in those areas. Another way is working toward becoming teachers. This is something that is written about in a couple different places, but I want you to consider these following three passages, because there are really different ways of understanding what it is to be a teacher. For example, consider these two passages. In James 3:1, James writes, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment." So James warns against not too many people becoming teachers. And then in 1 Timothy 2:12, Paul writes to Timothy, "But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." So within a church setting, there are only those certain people who can teach. And yet, when you get to Hebrews 5:12, the author of Hebrews writes, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food." So why do two passages limit who can become teachers and warn against too many people becoming teachers? And yet in Hebrews, the author really says that they're not where they ought to be and expects them to become teachers. And I think the answer is because you have to understand that there are different ways of understanding teachers. That on one sense, in the James sense and in the 1 Timothy sense, there are those like James, like Paul the Apostle, like Timothy the Evangelist, who are taking on these roles of teachers within the church and guiding them. But then there's the Hebrew sense, where we ought to know the foundations well enough to be able to tell those who have questions about it. And that's what I want us to focus on, is working toward becoming teachers in the Hebrew sense. That we can teach someone about God, about the Bible, about Jesus with confidence in regular conversation. This is one area I think we'll be striving to grow in this year. And this whole idea of personal development, and especially working toward becoming teachers, means that we need to be honest about what we don't know. And then we need to make the effort to find it out. So we need to realize what I'm lacking in, questions I may have. I don't know about you, but there are many times where I'm reading through the scripture and I come across a word or an idea that repeats, and I just think, what does that mean? And instead of writing it down and looking it up, I just keep going. This year, though, I'd like us to write it down and then search it out. To really be honest about what we don't know, the questions we have, and growing in those areas, so that we can work toward becoming teachers, so that we can, with confidence, tell someone else about God, about the Bible. And that doesn't mean you have to have the right answer all the time, but maybe you can have also the confidence to know where to go to search for answers and how to find answers. So personal development in terms of understanding our roles within the church and growing in that sense, of working toward becoming teachers, being confident that we can teach basic ideas and concepts to those who have questions. And in personal development, I also want us really to be asking ourselves, what role am I in the church, and what can I do to develop an ability to live out this role? The reason I started preaching is because I was at a church where the focus was, how are you going to contribute? In fact, the elders, when they would meet with people who wanted to become members, they would ask them, what are you going to do? How are you going to participate? And that really got me thinking about where my talents lie, where my abilities lie, where my weaknesses lie. What can I contribute to the church? How can I participate? And so personal development, I want us to understand in this light as well. How can I be an active member of this church? Where are my talents? Where are my abilities? What seems easy to me but seems hard to other people that I can contribute? So that's the idea of personal development, and I'll be developing lessons around this that we'll be revisiting. So personal development is going to be our third goal or theme. And the fourth is generosity. Being generous, and we'll get into what kind of generosity we're talking about in a moment. But generosity, we have to understand, first and foremost, is an attribute of God. God is very generous. So I have three passages here illustrating this. Just for example, in Exodus 34, verse 6, when God is passing before Moses, God says, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. God is generous with his loving kindness, with his truth, with his compassion, his graciousness. In Isaiah 55, verse 7, we read, let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. God abundantly pardons and forgives people. Or in James 1, verse 5, James writes, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So God gives very generously. Generosity is an attribute of God. And these passages, I hope, pointed out that God is not only generous in material things, although he is that too. But God is generous with his forgiveness. He's generous with his loving kindness. He's generous in bestowing wisdom. God is generous. It's an attribute of who God is. And so God's example then is to lead us to be generous. And Rich, you hit on it right in your talk on the offering. But in 1 John 3, 16 through 18, John writes that we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. And what I want to point out in this passage is that God's love is to lead to us being generous. And it's to leave, he says, lay down our lives for the brethren, but then he puts it even very simply, just giving goods to those who are in need, the brothers and sisters in need. So God's generosity, his example, is to lead to us being generous. So the kind of generosity we want to be looking at are going to be things, of course, like money. That is a way to be generous to people. And first, there are many people I know who that is how they contribute. That is how they're able to contribute. And that's a good thing to be generous in. We want to think about things, though, generosity in things like time. How can I be generous with my time? This is something I think is very necessary for our world today, because the world really affects the Christian mindset that I have come across in my experiences in working with a few different churches now, that there is this mindset of this is my time and really hoarding our time. And I don't want to dismiss the idea of alone time, because I think that's good and it's healthy and it's necessary. But I think we do often have time that we can give to other people, to God, to the things of God. And so we're going to be focusing on being generous with things like our time, being generous with things like our prayers, spending more time in prayer on behalf of other people, thinking about them, mentioning them by name, praying for them. So being generous with our prayers, being generous with things like compassion and mercy, as God is compassionate with his loving kindness. Really just pouring out more compassion on mercy to those around us. As well as, I think, being generous in things like worship. Really being generous with how much we put into worship. Why we worship God. How worthy of worship he is. You consider the woman who broke the alabaster flask over Jesus, and she could have limited her worship toward him, but she didn't. She was very generous in giving worship to Jesus. So those are going to be our 4 main themes and goals for this year. We're going to be focusing on a stronger presence in our community. We'll be focusing on responding and reaching out to visitors. Like I said, if that's something you can participate in and would like to be a part of, talk to me or one of the men as we organize this. Being really focused on personal growth, growing in our roles, our responsibilities, as well as working toward becoming teachers, being honest about where our knowledge is lacking and growing in that. And we want to focus on generosity, being generous in our prayers, in our time, in our money, in our worship, just being generous because of how generous God has been to us. Those are our goals and our themes for this year. And maybe not every lesson or class is going to fall into this, but they're going to be recurring themes and goals that we revisit throughout the year, that we spend time thinking about, meditating upon, things that are good that we can put into our minds. So I hope you are prepared for this year. At this time, we would like to offer an invitation. If you're here and you need prayers, if you're here and you'd like to be baptized, if you're here and there is anything at all we can do for you, if you have questions, anything at all, please make your need known now while we stand and sing the invitation song.